The record preserves the name of Goliath with clarity, yet it does not end with him. In the later passages, often read more quietly, the narrative returns to the same region and introduces others, figures described not as isolated opponents, but as part of a lingering presence tied to a specific place and lineage. These accounts appear within the closing military records of David's reign, where battles are listed with restraint and outcomes are recorded without elaboration. What emerges is not a single confrontation, but a sequence. The text presents a pattern, repeated encounters in Philistine territory, recurring references to unusual stature, and the gradual removal of figures connected to an earlier age. These moments are not framed as spectacle. They are embedded within lists of campaigns, names of warriors, and brief descriptions of conflict. We are therefore examining a portion of the record that speaks indirectly, where meaning is carried through repetition, location, and lineage. It is here, in these final conflicts, that the narrative closes a thread first introduced in earlier generations, and does so with deliberate restraint. The record continues in a quieter form. After the account of Goliath's fall, the narrative does not return to that moment. It does not revisit the valley, nor does it expand on the outcome beyond what has already been established. Instead, the text shifts forward, entering a different section of the historical record, one that preserves events with less detail and greater restraint. These passages appear within the closing structure of the books attributed to Samuel, where the narrative no longer unfolds in extended scenes, but is arranged as a sequence of recorded conflicts. The language changes. Where earlier chapters lingered over individual encounters, here the record becomes compressed. Battles are named, locations are noted, outcomes are stated. The structure resembles a register more than a story, and yet within this structure, a pattern begins to emerge. The record presents a continuation of conflict between Israel and the Philistines. This continuation is not introduced as something new. It is presented as an ongoing condition. The Philistines remain active along their established territories, and the narrative places the encounters within regions already known to the reader. The same cities appear. The same boundaries are implied. The text does not explain this continuity. It assumes it. Among these regions, one location appears with particular consistency: Gath. Gath is not introduced again. It is simply named, as though its significance has already been established. The city remains associated with earlier events, and its presence in these later passages connects the earlier narrative to what follows. The record does not draw attention to this connection. It allows the repetition of place to carry its own meaning. Another location appears in the same manner: Gob. Gob is mentioned without description. It is listed as the site of conflict, and the narrative moves forward. The absence of detail does not diminish its importance. Instead, it contributes to the pattern forming across these passages. The record identifies where events occur but does not pause to interpret them. Within this framework, the text introduces a sequence of battles. Each battle is presented with a similar structure. The record names the location. It identifies the opposing figure. It notes the individual from Israel who confronts that figure, and it concludes with the outcome. There is no extended dialogue. There is no description of movement or strategy. The narrative is contained within these elements, repeated with consistency. It is through this repetition that the record begins to suggest something beyond isolated events. The figures encountered in these battles are not described as unrelated individuals. The text associates them with a specific designation, one that appears more than once and is applied consistently. This designation is not explained in these passages. It is introduced as something already known within the broader record. The presence of this repeated designation signals that the encounters are connected. The narrative does not pause to define the term or to provide a genealogy. It simply uses the designation in relation to multiple individuals. This method allows the reader to recognize continuity without interrupting the flow of the record. The connection is established through recurrence rather than explanation. As the sequence develops, the pattern becomes more apparent. The battles occur within Philistine territory. The figures encountered share a common association. The outcomes are consistently recorded as defeats at the hands of individuals aligned with David. The structure does not vary. It remains steady across each account, reinforcing the sense that these are not singular events but parts of a larger process. The record does not frame this process as a campaign with a beginning and an end. There is no formal introduction announcing a new phase of war. There is no concluding statement marking its completion within these early entries. Instead, the encounters are placed within the broader narrative of David's reign, where military activity is recorded as part of the established order. The absence of framing allows the events to appear as a continuation rather than a separate chapter. Within this structure, David himself is present, but not in the same role as before. In the earlier account, David stood at the center of the confrontation. The narrative followed his actions in detail, tracing each step leading to the outcome. Here, his presence is more limited. He is named within the record, but the focus begins to shift toward others. The text introduces individuals identified as his servants. These servants are not described in extended terms. Their names appear alongside the events, and their actions are recorded briefly. Yet their inclusion marks a transition in how the narrative distributes agency. The conflicts are no longer centered on a single figure. They are carried out by a group acting within the structure of the kingdom. This shift does not diminish David's position. Instead, it reflects the development of the narrative from a single decisive encounter to a sustained series of engagements. The record preserves this development through its structure. It places David within the sequence while allowing others to act alongside him. The repetition of encounters begins to reveal another layer of continuity. The figures described in these passages are associated not only with each other, but also with the earlier narrative. The connection is not stated directly. It is implied through shared terminology, through recurring locations, and through the nature of the descriptions provided. The earlier account of Goliath is not repeated, yet its presence remains. The narrative does not treat it as an isolated event that resolved the conflict. Instead, it allows the subsequent passages to demonstrate that the conditions surrounding that encounter persisted. The presence of additional figures connected by the same designation suggests that Goliath was part of a broader context. This context is not fully explained within these passages. The record does not expand on the origins of these figures. It does not provide a historical account of their lineage. It simply presents them as they appear within the sequence of battles. The restraint of the narrative maintains focus on the events themselves rather than their background. As the sequence continues, the consistency of the structure becomes its defining feature. Each entry follows the same pattern. Each reinforces the connection between location, designation, and outcome. The repetition does not produce redundancy. It produces clarity. The reader is guided not by detailed description, but by the steady accumulation of aligned elements. Through this method, the record establishes that the conflict introduced earlier did not conclude with a single event. It continued across multiple encounters, each recorded within the same framework. The presence associated with the earlier narrative remains active within the same regions. The figures connected to that presence appear one after another, each meeting the same end. The narrative does not interpret this pattern. It does not assign meaning or provide commentary. It preserves the sequence as it is, allowing the structure itself to communicate continuity. The reader is left to observe the repetition and to recognize the connection that runs through these entries. In this way, the record transitions from a singular account to a series. The earlier focus on one individual expands into a broader examination of multiple figures linked by place and designation. The narrative does not announce this expansion. It allows it to unfold through the arrangement of its entries. And within this arrangement, the foundation is set for what follows. The pattern has been established. The locations have been named. The connection has been introduced. The narrative now holds these elements in place, ready to present them again with greater specificity in the entries that follow. The sequence continues without alteration in tone. The record maintains its measured form, preserving each encounter with the same deliberate restraint. No transition is announced between one entry and the next. There is no attempt to elevate one moment above another. Instead, the narrative proceeds with a consistent rhythm, allowing the accumulation of events to establish their collective significance. Within this structure, the recurring designation remains central. The figures encountered are not introduced with extended descriptions or individual histories. Each appears briefly, identified by name and associated with the same underlying classification. The repetition of this designation functions as the primary link between the entries. It is not explained within these passages, yet its repeated use provides continuity across the sequence. The effect is gradual rather than immediate. At first, the entries may appear as independent records of conflict. Each battle stands complete within its own boundaries. Yet as the sequence unfolds, the recurrence of location, designation, and outcome begins to form a unified pattern. The narrative does not draw attention to this development. It allows the structure itself to reveal the connection. The setting remains consistent. The encounters continue to take place within Philistine territory, most often in areas already established within the earlier narrative. Gath remains a point of reference, appearing again as the origin or association of those described. Gob appears as a site of conflict, its presence reinforcing the geographical continuity of the sequence. The record does not expand upon these locations. Their significance is carried through repetition alone. The figures themselves are introduced with minimal variation. Each is identified within the same framework: a name, an association with the recurring designation, and a confrontation with one of David's servants. The narrative does not describe their movements or actions in detail. It does not recount the moments leading to their defeat. Instead, it records the essential elements and proceeds. This approach preserves the focus on outcome rather than process. The defeat of each figure is stated plainly. There is no elaboration on the manner of victory. The text does not emphasize the difficulty or ease of the encounter. It simply records that the figure fell at the hands of a named individual. This uniformity contributes to the overall pattern, placing each event within the same structural role. The presence of David's servants becomes more defined. Although their actions are recorded briefly, their repeated involvement establishes them as the active agents within this sequence. Each encounter introduces a different individual from among them, and each is associated with a successful outcome. The narrative does not expand on their backgrounds or ranks. It presents them as part of a functioning body within the kingdom, acting in continuity with one another. The record does not separate these individuals into isolated accounts. Their actions are preserved within the same sequence, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. The repeated structure implies that these encounters are part of an ongoing process rather than unrelated events. The servants appear as participants within a shared effort, each contributing to the removal of the figures described. David's presence remains within the framework, but it is no longer central. He is named within the record, and his authority is implied through the actions of those aligned with him. Yet the narrative does not return to the detailed focus that characterized earlier accounts. Instead, it maintains the broader perspective established in this section, where events are recorded as part of the larger history of his reign. This shift allows the narrative to distribute emphasis across multiple figures. The earlier account concentrated on a single confrontation, presenting it with extended detail. Here, the emphasis is spread across a series of encounters, each contributing to the same overarching pattern. The record does not elevate one above the others. It preserves them with equal weight, allowing the repetition itself to carry significance. The designation associated with these figures continues to anchor the sequence. Each appearance reinforces the connection introduced earlier. The text does not define the term or explore its origin. It relies on the reader's recognition of its recurrence. Through this method, the narrative establishes a link between the figures without interrupting the flow of the record. The cumulative effect becomes more apparent as the entries progress. What begins as a series of brief records gradually forms a coherent sequence. The repeated elements, location, designation, and outcome, align across each entry, creating a structured pattern. The narrative does not summarize this pattern at once. It allows it to emerge through the accumulation of consistent details. The absence of elaboration remains a defining characteristic. The record does not provide interpretation or commentary. It does not explain why these encounters occur in this sequence. It does not explore the implications of the repeated designation. Instead, it maintains its restrained form, presenting the events as they are recorded. This restraint shapes the tone of the entire section. The narrative avoids emphasis on individual moments. It does not linger on any single encounter. Each entry is given space within the sequence, yet none is expanded beyond its essential elements. This approach creates a sense of continuity that extends across the entire passage. As the sequence nears its conclusion, the pattern remains unchanged. The same structure is preserved in each entry. The figures continue to appear within the same geographical context. The same designation continues to connect them. The same outcome is recorded. The repetition does not vary and it does not diminish. Instead, it reinforces the unity of the sequence. By maintaining consistency, the narrative ensures that each entry contributes to the same overarching structure. The reader is guided not by detailed storytelling, but by the alignment of recurring elements. The pattern itself becomes the primary means of communication. The record then moves toward a closing statement. This statement does not introduce new information. It gathers what has already been presented and places it within a single line. The figures described throughout the sequence are collectively identified as belonging to the same designation and associated with the same location. Their defeat is attributed to David and his servants as a group. This closing does not expand upon the events. It does not revisit individual encounters or provide additional detail. It simply affirms the pattern that has been established across the sequence. The repetition of elements throughout the entries is brought together in a concise form, completing the record of these conflicts. The narrative does not pause after this conclusion. It continues within the broader framework of the text, moving beyond this sequence without reflection or commentary. The events are preserved as part of the larger historical record, integrated into the account of David's reign. In this way, the record establishes that the earlier confrontation did not stand alone. It was part of a continued presence within the same regions, connected through repeated encounters and consistent outcomes. The sequence does not isolate these events. It presents them as a unified process, recorded within the same structure and brought to completion through the same pattern. The narrative leaves the pattern intact, without further explanation. And with this, the foundation is set for the examination of each figure within the sequence, where the record will present them individually, within the same measured form that has defined these entries. The record turns its attention to place. It does not begin with names or actions, but with locations, sites that appear with quiet consistency across the sequence. These places are not introduced as new. They are presented as known terrain, already established within the broader narrative. The text assumes familiarity with them, and in doing so, it allows geography to carry meaning without explanation. Among these locations, one name stands with particular weight: Gath. Gath is not described in detail. The record does not pause to outline its structure, its leadership, or its position among the Philistine cities. Yet its repeated appearance establishes it as more than a background setting. It functions as a point of origin, a place from which certain figures are consistently associated. The narrative returns to it without emphasis, and through that return, its importance is reinforced. The earlier account placed Goliath within this same context. Though the record does not restate that connection here, the association remains present. Gath becomes a fixed reference point, linking earlier events to those that follow. The narrative does not draw a direct line between them. It allows the shared location to create continuity. Another location appears alongside it: Gob. Gob is mentioned briefly, without elaboration. It is identified as the site of conflict, and the narrative proceeds. Its significance lies not in description but in repetition. The record places multiple encounters within this location, using it as a consistent setting for the unfolding sequence. The absence of detail does not diminish its role. Instead, it allows the location to function as a stable anchor within the narrative. The valley associated with the earlier confrontation remains present in the background. It is not named again in detail within these passages, yet its presence continues to shape the geography of the record. The earlier encounter did not exist in isolation. It occurred within a landscape that remains active, and the narrative now extends that landscape into subsequent events. The valley becomes part of a broader pattern of locations where conflict persists. The text does not explain this pattern. It does not provide a map or a description of territorial boundaries. Instead, it presents the locations as they appear within the sequence, allowing their recurrence to establish connection. The reader encounters the same names across different entries, and through this repetition, the geography begins to take form. Philistine territory remains the consistent setting. The encounters are not scattered across distant regions. They are concentrated within a defined area, one that the narrative returns to repeatedly. This concentration suggests continuity rather than expansion. The conflict is not moving outward. It is unfolding within the same established terrain. The cities within this territory are not described as isolated points. They function as part of a connected region. Gath, Gob, and the surrounding areas are presented as locations within a shared landscape. The narrative does not separate them into independent accounts. It places them within the same sequence, allowing the reader to perceive them as part of a unified setting. Within this setting, the encounters take on a different character. They are no longer singular events defined by unique circumstances. Instead, they become part of a recurring process within a fixed geography. The repetition of location removes the sense of randomness. Each encounter appears within a place that has already been established, reinforcing the idea of continuity. The record maintains its restrained approach. It does not describe the terrain in detail. There are no extended depictions of hills, fields, or structures. The locations are named, and their names are sufficient. The narrative relies on recognition rather than description, allowing the repetition of place to serve as its primary method of connection. The presence associated with these locations becomes more defined through this repetition. The figures encountered in these passages are consistently linked to the same region. Their association with Gath, in particular, establishes a point of origin that remains constant across the sequence. The narrative does not explore the significance of this association. It presents it as a given, allowing the reader to observe the pattern without interruption. This method shifts the focus of the narrative. The earlier account centered on a single confrontation within a specific location. Here, the emphasis moves toward the landscape itself. The repeated appearance of the same cities and regions transforms the setting into an active element of the narrative. The geography is no longer a backdrop. It becomes a framework within which the sequence unfolds. The continuity of place also affects how the encounters are perceived. Each battle is not presented as a new and unrelated event. It occurs within a location that has already been named, within a territory that has already been established. This continuity reduces the need for explanation. The narrative does not need to justify why the encounters occur in these places. Their recurrence provides its own justification. The record does not indicate movement between distant regions. There is no suggestion of a campaign extending beyond this established area. Instead, the encounters remain within the same geographic boundaries. This consistency reinforces the idea that the presence associated with these figures is rooted in a specific region, rather than dispersed across multiple territories. The cities themselves remain unchanged within the narrative. They are not described as shifting or developing over time. Their role is stable. They serve as fixed points within the sequence, anchoring each encounter in a recognizable location. The narrative does not expand on their internal structure or their relationship to one another. It presents them as they are, allowing their repetition to establish their significance. As the sequence continues, the reader becomes familiar with these names. Gath appears again. Gob appears again. The surrounding Philistine territory remains the setting for each encounter. The repetition is steady, and it does not vary. Through this steadiness, the narrative constructs a sense of place that extends across the entire sequence. The geography begins to function as a unifying element. It connects separate entries into a single framework. Each encounter is linked not only by the figures involved, but also by the locations in which they occur. The repeated naming of these places creates continuity across the sequence, allowing the reader to perceive the events as part of a sustained presence within the same region. The record does not draw attention to this development. It does not pause to summarize the pattern. It continues to present each entry in the same manner, allowing the accumulation of locations to establish the connection. The geography is revealed gradually, through repetition rather than explanation. In this way, the narrative prepares the ground for what follows. The locations have been established. The pattern of recurrence has been set in place. The reader is now positioned within a defined landscape, where each subsequent encounter will unfold within the same geographic framework. The pattern of place continues to unfold with quiet precision. The record does not alter its method. It continues to name locations without elaboration, allowing their recurrence to establish a sense of permanence. Each entry reinforces the same geographic framework, and with each repetition, the landscape becomes more clearly defined, not through description, but through consistency. Gath remains central within this framework. Its name appears again, associated with the figures introduced in these encounters. The narrative does not pause to explain why this city is repeatedly linked to them. It presents the association as established, allowing the reader to recognize it through repetition. Gath functions as a point of origin, a place that consistently stands behind the figures described, even when the encounters occur elsewhere. The relationship between origin and location becomes more apparent. While some conflicts take place in Gob or in surrounding areas, the figures themselves are tied back to Gath. This distinction is not emphasized, but it is preserved within the structure of the record. The place where the encounter occurs and the place from which the figure is associated are not always the same. This subtle separation allows the narrative to maintain both movement and continuity at once. Gob continues to appear as a site of engagement. Its presence is consistent, and like Gath, it is not described in detail. The record names it, and the narrative proceeds. Through repetition, Gob becomes recognized as a recurring ground of conflict. It does not function as a point of origin, but as a place where encounters are carried out. The distinction between these roles is maintained quietly within the structure of the text. The surrounding Philistine territory remains the broader setting. The narrative does not expand beyond it. The encounters do not move into distant regions or unfamiliar lands. They remain within the same geographical boundaries, reinforcing the sense that the events are concentrated within a defined area. This concentration is not explained, but it is consistently presented. The valley associated with earlier events continues to shape the narrative indirectly. Though not described in these passages, its presence lingers within the geography of the record. The earlier confrontation established the region as a place of significance, and the subsequent entries do not depart from that setting. Instead, they extend it, allowing the earlier location to remain part of a larger and ongoing pattern. The repetition of place creates a layered effect. Each location carries with it the weight of its previous appearances. When Gath is named again, it does not stand alone. It brings with it the memory of earlier associations. When Gob is mentioned, it recalls prior encounters recorded within the same structure. The narrative does not state this layering explicitly. It allows the repetition to build it. This layering reinforces continuity across the sequence. The encounters are not isolated within separate spaces. They occur within locations that have already been established, and this continuity binds them together. The geography becomes a means of connection, linking each entry to those that precede it. The record maintains its restrained tone throughout. It does not provide descriptions of terrain, distances, or boundaries. It does not explain the relationship between one city and another. Instead, it presents the locations as fixed points within the narrative. The reader is expected to recognize them through repetition rather than through detailed explanation. Within this framework, the presence associated with these locations becomes more clearly rooted. The figures described in these passages are consistently linked to the same region. Their association with Gath remains unchanged, and their appearances within other locations do not alter that connection. The narrative preserves this consistency, allowing the geography to define the scope of their presence. The concentration of encounters within this region suggests stability rather than dispersion. The narrative does not indicate that these figures appear across multiple territories. It does not present them as scattered or widespread. Instead, it confines them within the same geographic framework, reinforcing the idea that their presence is localized. This localization shapes the structure of the narrative. Each encounter occurs within a place that has already been named. The repetition of these places removes the need for additional context. The reader is not introduced to new regions or unfamiliar terrain. The narrative remains within its established boundaries, allowing the focus to remain on the sequence itself. The cities and locations function as anchors within the text. They provide fixed reference points that stabilize the narrative as it moves from one encounter to the next. Without extended description, these anchors maintain continuity. The reader moves through the sequence guided by familiar names, each reinforcing the structure of the whole. As the entries progress, the geography becomes inseparable from the events. The encounters cannot be separated from the places in which they occur. Each location carries its own role within the sequence: Gath as origin, Gob as site of engagement, the surrounding territory as the broader framework. These roles are not assigned through explanation. They emerge through repeated use. The record does not alter this pattern. It continues to present each entry within the same geographic structure. The repetition remains steady, and the locations retain their roles. There is no shift in setting, no expansion into new regions. The narrative remains contained within its established framework. This containment prepares the narrative for a more focused examination of the figures themselves. With the geography firmly in place, the reader is no longer oriented by unfamiliar settings. The locations have become stable, recognized through repetition. The narrative can now move forward within this framework, introducing individuals whose appearances will be understood in relation to these same places. The geography does not recede as the narrative progresses. It remains present, continuing to anchor each encounter within the same structure. The repeated nomming of Gath and Gob ensures that the reader remains within the same landscape, even as new figures are introduced. The continuity of place supports the continuity of the sequence. The record concludes this phase without emphasis. It does not summarize the geography or reflect upon its significance. It simply continues, preserving the pattern of location across each entry. The cities and regions remain as they have been named, repeated, and fixed within the narrative. In this way, the landscape is established not through description, but through recurrence. And within this established landscape, the narrative is prepared to present the individuals who emerge from it, each connected to the same region and identified within the same measured form. The record introduces a name without explanation. It appears within the sequence of conflicts, attached to individuals who are otherwise presented with minimal detail. The narrative does not pause to define it, nor does it provide a genealogy or an origin. Instead, the term is placed alongside these figures as a point of identification, and then the record continues. The name is preserved as the descendants of Rapha. It is not introduced as a new concept. The text presents it as something already known within the broader record. There is no attempt to establish its meaning within these passages. The designation functions as a marker, applied consistently to certain individuals encountered in the sequence of battles. This consistency gives the term its weight. Each time a figure is introduced with this designation, the narrative reinforces a connection. The individuals are not described as unrelated. They are presented as belonging to a shared classification. The repetition of the term allows the reader to recognize this connection without interruption. The record does not describe the lineage in full. It does not trace the descent of Rapha or outline the structure of the group associated with the name. The absence of detail does not diminish its importance. Instead, it preserves the focus of the narrative on the encounters themselves, while allowing the designation to function as an underlying thread. This thread connects the sequence across multiple entries. The figures appear one after another, each identified briefly, each associated with the same term. The narrative does not expand on their individual characteristics at first. It places them within the same framework, allowing the designation to define their relationship to one another. The effect is cumulative. With each repetition, the term gains clarity through usage rather than explanation. The reader begins to understand that the figures encountered are not isolated. They belong to a group that is recognized within the record, even if its full context is not provided here. The designation also carries an association with physical description. The text includes brief references to unusual stature or distinguishing features when introducing these figures. These descriptions are not elaborated upon. They are stated and then left without interpretation. The narrative does not emphasize them beyond their inclusion. Yet their presence aligns with the designation. The association between the term and these physical descriptions is not explained directly. It is implied through repetition. Each figure connected to the designation shares certain characteristics, and the narrative preserves these details with restraint. This method allows the record to maintain consistency without expansion. The designation remains constant. The physical descriptions appear in brief form. The encounters are recorded in the same structure. Together, these elements create a pattern that does not require further explanation within the text. The name itself functions as a bridge. It links the figures described in these passages to earlier references within the broader record. Those earlier references are not restated here. The narrative assumes their presence and uses the designation to connect the current sequence to that earlier context. This connection is not developed through commentary. The text does not pause to interpret the relationship. It does not explain how the earlier references relate to the figures encountered now. It simply preserves the name, allowing it to carry continuity across the narrative. The use of the designation also shapes how the figures are introduced. Rather than presenting each individual as a unique anomaly, the narrative frames them as members of a recognized group. This framing reduces the need for extensive description. The reader understands each figure in relation to the designation, rather than through detailed individual accounts. The structure of the record supports this approach. Each entry follows the same pattern. The figure is named. The designation is applied. The encounter is recorded. The outcome is stated. The repetition of this structure reinforces the role of the designation as the primary link between the entries. The narrative does not elevate one figure above the others at this stage. Each is presented within the same framework, with the same level of detail. The designation ensures that their connection is understood, even as their individual appearances remain brief. The presence of this lineage within the record also explains the recurrence of these encounters. The figures are not appearing randomly. They are connected through a shared designation, and their repeated appearance within the same geographic framework reflects that connection. The narrative does not state this explicitly, but the pattern becomes clear through repetition. The term descendants of Rapha provides a structure for understanding the sequence. It allows the reader to interpret the encounters as part of a broader continuity. The figures are not isolated opponents. They are part of a group that persists within the same region and is encountered repeatedly within the narrative. The record does not explore the origins of this group in these passages. It does not provide a historical account of their beginnings or their development over time. The focus remains on their presence within the sequence of battles. The designation is used as a point of reference, not as a subject of explanation. This restraint maintains the tone of the narrative. The text continues to present events in a measured and consistent manner. It does not expand beyond what is necessary to record the encounters. The designation is included because it is relevant to the identification of the figures, and nothing further is added. As the sequence progresses, the designation remains unchanged. It is applied consistently across each entry, reinforcing the connection between the figures. The narrative does not vary its use of the term. This consistency strengthens its role as the central link within the sequence. The reader is guided through recognition rather than instruction. The record does not explain what the designation means in full. It allows the reader to observe its repeated application and to understand its significance through that repetition. The connection between the figures becomes evident without the need for additional commentary. In this way, the lineage is preserved within the text. It is not expanded, defined, or interpreted within these passages. It is presented as it appears in the record, functioning as a structural element that connects the sequence of encounters. And through this structure, the narrative prepares for a closer examination of the individuals themselves, who will be introduced within the same framework, each bearing the same designation and appearing within the same measured form. The designation continues to operate without alteration. The record maintains its use of the term with the same consistency, attaching it to each figure encountered within the sequence. There is no variation in how it is applied, and no additional detail is introduced to redefine it. The repetition itself becomes the primary means by which the lineage is preserved. Within this structure, the name Rapha remains fixed. It does not shift in form, nor is it replaced by another term. The narrative holds to it with precision, ensuring that each appearance reinforces the same connection. The figures are not grouped loosely. They are identified through a designation that remains exact in its wording. This precision contributes to the clarity of the sequence. The record does not distinguish between different branches of the lineage. It does not separate the figures into subgroups or assign them individual genealogies. Each is presented within the same classification, and the narrative does not expand beyond that. The absence of subdivision maintains the simplicity of the structure, allowing the designation to function as a single, unifying element. The physical descriptions associated with these figures continue to appear in measured form. They are not elaborated upon, but they are included with enough consistency to align with the designation. References to stature or distinctive features are stated briefly and then left without interpretation. The narrative does not emphasize these details beyond their inclusion, yet their recurrence strengthens the association with the lineage. These descriptions do not stand alone. They appear alongside the designation, reinforcing the connection between identity and physical form. The record does not explain the relationship between the two. It presents them together, allowing the reader to recognize the alignment through repetition. The sequence of encounters remains structured around this framework. Each entry introduces a figure, applies the designation, records the encounter, and states the outcome. The lineage is embedded within this structure, appearing at the point of identification. It does not interrupt the flow of the narrative. It is integrated into it. The narrative does not elevate the designation into a subject of its own. It does not pause to reflect on its meaning or its implications. The term remains part of the record, functioning as a point of reference rather than a focus of discussion. This restraint ensures that the sequence maintains its steady progression. The continuity established by the designation becomes more apparent as the entries accumulate. The repeated use of the term across multiple encounters removes the possibility of viewing each figure as an isolated presence. The narrative presents them as part of a known group, encountered repeatedly within the same geographic framework. The lineage provides a consistent explanation for this recurrence. The record does not state this explanation directly. It does not declare that the figures belong to a single family or group within the text itself. It allows the repeated application of the designation to establish that understanding. The reader recognizes the connection through the structure of the entries. The association between the lineage and the geographic setting remains unchanged. The figures identified with this designation continue to appear within the same regions. Their connection to Gath is preserved, and their encounters occur within the same surrounding territory. The narrative does not expand beyond this framework. The lineage and the geography remain aligned. This alignment reinforces the sense of continuity across the sequence. The figures are not introduced from distant or unrelated regions. They appear within the same landscape, carrying the same designation. The repetition of both elements, place and lineage, creates a stable framework within which the encounters are recorded. The record maintains its focus on the present sequence. It does not return to earlier passages to restate the origins of the designation. It does not anticipate future developments. It preserves the lineage as it appears within these encounters, allowing it to function within the immediate structure of the narrative. The absence of elaboration remains consistent. The text does not provide additional context for the name Rapha. It does not describe the beginnings of the lineage or its extent beyond the figures encountered. The designation is presented as sufficient for identification, and the narrative proceeds. This approach preserves the clarity of the sequence. The reader is not required to navigate extended explanations or background details. The repeated use of the designation provides a clear and consistent link between the figures, allowing the narrative to move forward without interruption. The figures themselves remain defined by their association with this lineage. Their individual names are recorded, but their connection to the designation remains central. The narrative does not separate their identity from the lineage. Each is introduced within the same framework, reinforcing the unity of the group. The repetition of this structure ensures that the lineage remains present throughout the sequence. It is not confined to a single entry. It appears consistently, linking each encounter to those that precede it. The narrative does not allow the designation to fade from view. It remains a constant element within the record. As the sequence approaches its conclusion, the role of the lineage becomes fully established. The reader has encountered multiple figures, each identified with the same designation, each appearing within the same geographic framework, and each meeting the same outcome. The pattern is complete, and the lineage stands as the central connection between these entries. The record, then, gathers these elements into its closing statement. The figures are collectively identified as belonging to the same designation, and their defeat is attributed to David and his servants. This final reference does not expand on the lineage. It confirms its presence across the sequence, bringing together the repeated elements into a single line. The narrative does not extend beyond this confirmation. It does not revisit individual encounters or provide further detail about the lineage. It concludes the sequence with the same restraint that has defined it, allowing the pattern to remain intact. In this way, the lineage of Rapha is preserved within the text. It is not explained in full, but it is consistently applied. It connects the figures across multiple entries, aligning them within the same structure and the same setting. The narrative maintains this connection without interruption, allowing the designation to function as the central link within the sequence. And with this foundation in place, the record is prepared to present each figure more distinctly, while maintaining the same framework that has defined their connection. The record narrows its focus to a single encounter. After presenting the pattern of repeated conflicts and the lineage associated with the figures involved, the narrative introduces the first individual within that sequence by name. The structure remains consistent, yet the presence of detail increases slightly. The figure is identified not only by designation, but by a specific name, Ishbi-Benob. He is presented within the setting already established. The encounter occurs during one of the ongoing conflicts between Israel and the Philistines. The location is not expanded upon, but it remains within the same geographic framework that has defined the sequence. The narrative does not shift its setting. It introduces the individual within the same landscape, allowing continuity to remain intact. The designation is applied immediately. Ishbi-Benob is identified as one of the descendants of Rapha. The record does not pause to explain this association. It presents it as part of his identity, maintaining the same method used in earlier entries. The lineage remains central, even as the narrative begins to provide more specific detail about the individual. A description is included. The text records the weight of his weapon. This detail is given without elaboration, yet it stands out within the restrained structure of the narrative. The inclusion of such a measurement introduces a tangible element, grounding the encounter in physical terms. The record does not interpret this detail. It presents it as part of the account and moves forward. The figure is also defined by his intent. The narrative states that Ishbi-Benob sought to strike the king. This intention is recorded plainly, without dramatization. It establishes the direction of the encounter and identifies David as the target. The record does not describe the movement toward this action. It states the intent, and in doing so, it defines the moment. David is present within the encounter. This marks a return to his direct involvement in conflict. Yet the nature of his presence differs from earlier accounts. The narrative does not center entirely on his actions. Instead, it places him within the event as one participant among others. The focus begins to expand beyond him. A condition is noted. The record indicates that David had grown weary. This statement is brief, yet it introduces a significant element into the narrative. The text does not elaborate on the cause of this weariness. It does not describe its extent or its duration. It presents the condition as part of the moment, allowing it to stand without explanation. This detail alters the structure of the encounter. In earlier accounts, David's strength and readiness were assumed. Here, the record introduces a limitation. The presence of weariness changes the balance of the scene. It does not shift the outcome yet, but it prepares the narrative for a different resolution. The confrontation reaches its point of action. The record does not describe the exchange in detail. It does not present a sequence of movements or a description of the struggle. It moves directly from intention to intervention. The structure remains concise, maintaining the tone established in previous entries. Another figure enters the account. Abishai, one of David's servants, is named within the record. His presence is introduced at the moment of need, and his action is stated clearly. He strikes Ishbi-benob and brings the encounter to its conclusion. The narrative does not expand on his method or the circumstances of the strike. It records the outcome and proceeds. This moment establishes a shift. The encounter does not end through David's direct action. Instead, it is resolved by one of his warriors. The narrative does not emphasize this change with commentary. It presents the event within the same structure, allowing the difference to be observed through the arrangement of details. The role of Abishai is defined through this action. He is not introduced with a background or a description of his position. His identity is conveyed through his association with David and his action within the encounter. The record allows his intervention to establish his significance. The presence of multiple participants becomes more apparent. The encounter is no longer confined to a single figure facing an opponent. It involves David, Ishbi-benob, and Abishai. The narrative expands the structure of conflict to include more than one active agent. This expansion remains within the same restrained form, but its implications are clear. The outcome is recorded without variation. Ishbi-benob falls and the narrative moves forward. The structure remains consistent with previous entries. The figure is named, the encounter is noted, and the outcome is stated. The addition of detail does not alter the overall form of the record. Following the encounter, a decision is preserved. David's servants speak to him and establish a boundary. They declare that he is no longer to go out with them to battle. The record presents this statement without elaboration. It does not include extended reasoning or discussion. The decision is stated, and its significance is left within the text. This decision reflects the condition noted earlier. The mention of David's weariness is not repeated, yet it remains connected to this outcome. The narrative does not restate the link. It allows the sequence of events to establish the relationship between the condition and the decision. The language used in this statement is measured. The servants express concern for the preservation of the king. The record does not expand on their reasoning. It includes their words as part of the account, allowing them to stand within the narrative without further interpretation. This moment introduces a transition in the structure of the sequence. The encounters that follow will not center on David in the same way. The narrative prepares for this shift without announcing it directly. The decision made by the servants establishes a new pattern for how these conflicts will be recorded. The presence of Ishbi-benob serves as the entry point into this transition. His appearance marks the first instance in which the narrative introduces a named figure within this sequence, and pairs that introduction with a change in the dynamics of leadership and action. The record does not pause after this event. It continues within the same framework, preserving the pattern of encounters while allowing this moment to stand as a point of change within the structure. The record continues from the moment of decision without altering its tone. The statement made by David's servants remains within the text as a fixed point. It is not revisited, and it is not expanded. The narrative does not describe how David responds, nor does it record any exchange beyond the words that have been preserved. The decision stands as it is given, integrated into the sequence as part of the unfolding structure. This moment establishes a boundary. David is no longer positioned as the one who will meet these figures directly in the encounters that follow. The narrative does not frame this as a withdrawal or a change in authority. It presents it as an adjustment within the ongoing conflicts. The king remains present within the record, yet his role begins to shift. The encounters continue, but their structure has been altered. Where David once stood at the center of the confrontation, the narrative now prepares to place his servants in that position. This change is not announced as a new phase. It is introduced through the outcome of the encounter with Ishbi-Benob and the decision that follows it. The figure of Ishbi-Benob remains significant within this structure. He is the first named individual within the sequence to be identified with the designation and to confront the king directly. His appearance brings together the elements that have been established in earlier passages, lineage, geography, and conflict, and places them within a single encounter that carries additional detail. The record preserves specific elements of his description. The weight of his weapon remains noted, anchoring the figure in physical terms. This detail does not reappear in expanded form, but its presence within the account distinguishes this encounter from those that precede it. The narrative includes it as part of the identification, allowing it to stand without interpretation. His intention toward David remains central. The text does not describe the movement toward the king or the progression of the encounter. It states the intent, and through that statement, defines the direction of the event. The clarity of this detail allows the narrative to move forward without additional explanation. The presence of David's weariness continues to shape the understanding of the moment. Though it is not repeated, it remains connected to the outcome. The narrative does not expand on this condition, yet it has already altered the structure of the encounter. The shift introduced in Part 1 carries forward into the sequence, influencing how subsequent events will unfold. Abishai's role is preserved through his action. The record does not add further detail to his identity. It does not describe his position within the broader structure of David's servants. His significance is established through the intervention itself. By striking Ishbi-Benob and concluding the encounter, he becomes the first within the sequence to act in place of the king. This action sets a pattern. The narrative does not state this explicitly, but the structure now allows for similar interventions to occur. The presence of David's servants as active agents in these encounters has been established. The sequence is prepared to continue within this adjusted framework. The decision made by the servants reinforces this pattern. Their statement introduces a limitation on David's direct involvement, and by doing so, it creates space for others to act. The narrative does not expand on how this decision is implemented. It preserves the statement and moves forward, allowing the sequence itself to reflect the change. The language used within the decision remains measured. The servants express concern for the preservation of the king, referring to him in terms that reflect his role within the kingdom. The record does not elaborate on this expression. It includes it as part of the account, allowing it to stand within the structure of the narrative. This inclusion adds another layer to the encounter. The event is not only a conflict between individuals, it also introduces a consideration of leadership and continuity. The narrative does not develop this theme through explanation. It presents it through the words of the servants, integrated into the sequence without interruption. The encounter with Ishbi-Benob remains distinct within the record. It is the first instance in which multiple elements converge: a named figure associated with the lineage, a direct threat to the king, a noted condition affecting David, and an intervention by one of his servants. The combination of these elements distinguishes this entry from those that precede it. The structure, however, remains consistent. The narrative does not expand into extended description or analysis. It preserves the same concise form, recording the essential details and proceeding to the next entry. The additional elements do not alter the tone. They are integrated into the existing framework. The role of the lineage remains unchanged. Ishbi-Benob is identified as one of the descendants of Rapha, and this designation continues to link him to the broader sequence. The narrative does not explore this connection further within this passage. It maintains the same method of identification used throughout the record. The geography remains consistent as well. The encounter occurs within the same regions that have defined the sequence. The narrative does not introduce a new setting. It preserves the established landscape, allowing the focus to remain on the individuals and their actions within that framework. As the account concludes, the outcome is affirmed. Ishbi-Benob falls, and the immediate threat is removed. The narrative does not return to the event or expand upon its consequences. It records the conclusion and continues within the same structure. The transition introduced by this encounter remains in place. The decision of the servant stands as part of the record, shaping the structure of the encounters that follow. The narrative does not revisit it, yet its presence continues to influence the sequence. In this way, the first named encounter within the final conflicts establishes a new arrangement. The king remains within the narrative, but the responsibility for confronting these figures begins to shift toward those around him. The record presents this change without emphasis, allowing it to emerge through the arrangement of events. And with this adjustment in place, the sequence continues, prepared to introduce the next figure within the same lineage, within the same geography, and within the same measured form that now reflects a shared role in these encounters. The record holds on the moment of intervention. It does not return to the broader sequence immediately. Instead, it preserves the action of a single individual within that sequence and allows it to stand with clarity. The figure is Abishai, identified within the text as one of David's servants. His presence in the encounter with Ishbi-Benob is brief in description, yet it carries structural weight within the narrative. The account does not expand on his background. Abishai is not introduced through lineage or rank within this passage. The record does not pause to describe his position among David's men. It presents him through his action. His identity is conveyed through association and through the outcome of the encounter. The intervention occurs at a defined moment. The narrative has already established the intention of Ishbi-Benob and the condition of David. These elements remain present as the encounter reaches its point of action. The record does not describe the sequence of movements leading to this moment. It presents the intervention as a direct response within the event. Abishai strikes the opponent. This action is stated without elaboration. The text does not describe the method or the circumstances of the strike. It records the essential outcome. Ishbi-Benob falls. The intervention is complete within a single line and the narrative proceeds. The significance of this action is not explained within the record. There is no commentary following the event. The text does not pause to interpret the meaning of Abishai's intervention. It allows the arrangement of details to communicate its importance. The reader observes that the encounter is resolved not by David, but by one of his servants. This distinction marks a change in the structure of the narrative. In earlier accounts, David's actions were central to the outcome of such encounters. Here, the resolution is achieved by another. The record does not present this as an exception. It introduces it as part of the sequence, integrated into the same restrained form. The presence of Abishai within this moment establishes a new pattern. The narrative now includes additional active agents within the encounters. The conflict is no longer confined to a single figure facing an opponent. It is carried out by individuals within a group, each acting within the structure of the kingdom. The record does not expand on this group. It does not list its members or define its organization in this passage. It introduces one individual through his action and allows that action to represent a broader development. The presence of Abishai becomes a point of reference for the role of others. The condition of David remains connected to this shift. The earlier mention of his weariness is not repeated, yet it continues to shape the understanding of the encounter. The narrative does not restate this condition. It allows the sequence of events to carry its influence forward. Following the intervention, the record preserves a statement. David's servants address him directly, and their words are included within the text. They declare that he is no longer to go out with them to battle. This statement is recorded without expansion. The narrative does not include further dialogue or explanation. The decision is presented as a response to the event. The record does not analyze the reasoning behind it. It does not describe a discussion among the servants or a deliberation of options. It includes the statement as it stands, allowing its placement within the sequence to establish its connection to the encounter. The language used reflects concern for the king. The servants refer to David in terms that emphasize his role within the kingdom. Their words suggest the importance of preserving him, yet the narrative does not elaborate on this concern. It presents the statement and moves forward. This moment introduces a boundary within the sequence. The king is no longer positioned as the one who will directly confront these figures in the encounters that follow. The narrative does not frame this boundary as a withdrawal from conflict. It presents it as an adjustment within the ongoing structure. The presence of Abishai's intervention becomes the foundation for this adjustment. His action demonstrates that others within the group are capable of resolving such encounters. The narrative does not state this explicitly. It allows the event to serve as an example within the sequence. The record maintains its measured tone. It does not elevate the moment through extended description. It does not assign greater emphasis to the intervention beyond its inclusion. The significance of the event is carried through its placement within the structure of the narrative. The introduction of this decision also shapes the progression of the sequence. The encounters that follow will be recorded within the same framework, yet the role of David will be altered. The narrative prepares for this shift without announcing it directly. The statement of the servants remains as a fixed point within the text. The action of Abishai and the decision that follows are preserved together. They are not separated within the record. The intervention leads directly into the statement, and both are included within the same entry. This arrangement reinforces their connection. The narrative does not revisit the moment after presenting it. It does not return to Abishai's action or expand on the decision of the servants. It allows the event to stand as it is recorded, integrated into the sequence without further elaboration. Through this structure, the record establishes the emergence of a broader group within the encounters. The king remains present, yet the responsibility for action begins to extend beyond him. The intervention of Abishai serves as the first clear instance of this development within the sequence. And with this moment preserved, the narrative prepares to continue within the same framework, now shaped by the presence of those who stand alongside the king and act within the same measured form. The record continues with the decision preserved as a fixed point within the sequence. It does not return to the moment of intervention with additional detail. It does not expand upon Abishai's action or describe its immediate aftermath. Instead, it allows the statement made by David's servants to remain as the defining response to the encounter. The narrative proceeds with this decision in place, integrating it into the structure without further commentary. The words of the servant establish a lasting adjustment. They do not present their statement as temporary or conditional. The language is direct, forming a boundary that is not revisited or revised within the text. The record does not include a reply from David, nor does it describe any resistance or acceptance. The decision stands as it is given. This boundary alters the arrangement of subsequent encounters. The king remains within the narrative, yet his role shifts from direct engagement to presence within the broader framework. The responsibility for confronting the figures associated with the lineage is no longer centered on him. The narrative prepares to distribute that responsibility among those who stand with him. The emergence of this group becomes more defined through repetition. Abishai's action is not expanded into a broader description of his position, yet it establishes a pattern that the narrative will continue to follow. The servants of David are not introduced individually with extended detail. Their identity is conveyed through their actions within the sequence. Each action reinforces the structure introduced here. The intervention of Abishai is not presented as an isolated moment. It becomes the first instance in a pattern where members of David's circle act in place of the king. The narrative does not state this pattern explicitly. It allows it to unfold through subsequent entries. The preservation of the king remains central within the decision. The servants refer to David in terms that reflect his significance within the kingdom. The record includes this expression without elaboration. It does not explain the broader implications of their concern. It presents their words as part of the sequence, allowing the reader to observe their intent. The tone remains consistent. There is no elevation of emotion or expansion of reasoning. The narrative maintains its restrained form, recording the statement and continuing forward. The importance of the decision is conveyed through its placement rather than through interpretation. The encounter with Ishbi-Benob now stands as a point of transition. It is not separated from the sequence, yet it introduces a structural change that will shape what follows. The intervention of Abishai and the decision of the servants are preserved together, forming a single moment within the record that carries forward into the remaining entries. The role of the lineage remains unchanged within this transition. Ishbi-Benob is identified as one of the descendants of Rapha, and this designation continues to define the figures encountered in the sequence. The shift in leadership dynamics does not alter the classification of the opponents. The narrative maintains consistency in this element. The geography also remains fixed. The encounters continue to occur within the same regions that have been established earlier. The shift introduced by the intervention does not affect the setting. The narrative preserves the same locations, allowing the structure of place to remain constant as the roles within the encounters evolve. The combination of stable elements and shifting roles defines this phase of the sequence. The lineage remains consistent. The geography remains unchanged. The structure of the encounters nomming the figure, identifying the designation, recording the outcome, remains intact. Within this stability, the role of the king transitions and the role of his servants becomes more prominent. The record does not highlight this contrast directly. It does not draw attention to the difference between earlier and later encounters. It allows the arrangement of events to communicate the shift. The reader observes the change through the presence of new active agents within the same framework. The servants themselves are not presented as a unified body through description. They are introduced individually within the sequence, each identified by name when they act. The narrative does not provide a collective overview of their number or their organization. Their unity is implied through their shared association with David and their repeated involvement in these encounters. Abishai's role remains foundational within this pattern. His intervention establishes the possibility for others to act in similar ways. The narrative does not return to him in this passage, yet his action continues to shape the structure of the sequence. It stands as the first clear instance of this distributed responsibility. The decision of the servants ensures that this pattern will continue. By establishing that David will no longer go out to battle in this manner, the record creates space for the subsequent encounters to be resolved by others. The narrative does not explain how this decision is implemented in each case. It allows the sequence itself to demonstrate its effect. The outcome of the encounter with Ishbi-Benob remains unchanged. The figure falls, and the immediate threat is removed. The narrative does not expand on the consequences of this outcome beyond the decision that follows. It preserves the event within its structure and proceeds. As the sequence moves forward, the role of David becomes more defined through absence of direct action. He remains present within the record, yet the encounters no longer center on his actions. The narrative does not remove him from the sequence. It adjusts his position within it, allowing others to act within the same framework. The record concludes this phase without emphasis. It does not summarize the significance of the intervention or the decision. It does not reflect upon the change introduced. It continues with the same measured tone, preserving the structure that has been established. In this way, the intervention of Abishai and the decision of the servants become integrated elements within the sequence. They do not stand apart from the narrative. They are part of its structure, shaping how the encounters will be recorded as the sequence continues. And within this adjusted framework, the narrative is prepared to present the next figure, who will appear within the same lineage, within the same geography, and within a structure now carried forward by the actions of David's warriors. The record proceeds without alteration in form. Following the encounter with Ishbi-Benob and the decision that established a boundary around the king, the narrative continues within the same structure. It does not introduce a new phase or mark a transition. Instead, it presents the next encounter as part of the same ongoing sequence, maintaining the same measured tone and arrangement. A new figure is named. The text introduces Saph. The name appears briefly, without additional description beyond what is necessary for identification. As with previous entries, the narrative does not expand upon his background. It presents him within the established framework and proceeds. The designation is applied immediately. Saph is identified as one of the descendants of Rapha. The record maintains consistency in this element, attaching the same term to each figure encountered within the sequence. The narrative does not define the designation again. It allows its repeated use to carry continuity across the entries. The location of the encounter is preserved within the same geographic pattern. The battle takes place in Philistine territory, and the record identifies Gob once more as the site of conflict. The name appears without elaboration. Its repetition reinforces its role as a recurring ground of engagement. The narrative does not expand on the setting. It maintains the same approach, allowing the place to function as a stable anchor. The structure of the entry follows the established form. The figure is named, the designation is stated, the location is recorded, the outcome is presented. There is no variation in this arrangement. The narrative preserves its concise style, ensuring that each encounter aligns with those that precede it. A warrior from among David's servants is introduced. The text names Sibbecai the Hushathite. His presence is recorded in the same manner as Abishai's in the earlier encounter. The narrative does not provide extended detail about him. His identity is conveyed through his association with David and his action within the event. The confrontation is resolved without elaboration. The record states that Sibbecai struck Saph, and the outcome is final. There is no description of the encounter beyond this statement. The narrative does not include the progression of the conflict or the manner of the strike. It records the result and proceeds. This consistency reinforces the pattern established earlier. The encounter follows the same structure as the previous one, with the notable difference that David is no longer directly involved. The narrative does not highlight this difference through commentary. It allows the absence of David's direct action to reflect the decision made by the servants. The role of David's warriors becomes more clearly defined. Sibbecai's action aligns with the pattern introduced through Abishai. The responsibility for confronting these figures now rests with those within David's circle. The narrative does not state this shift explicitly. It presents it through the arrangement of events. The repetition of this structure builds continuity. Each element, name, designation, location, outcome, is preserved in the same order. The reader encounters the same sequence of details, allowing the connection between entries to remain clear. The narrative does not rely on extended explanation. It relies on the consistency of its form. The figure of Saph confirms the presence of multiple individuals within the lineage. The narrative does not present him as an isolated figure. His identification as one of the descendants of Rapha aligns him with those already encountered. The repetition of the designation removes any sense of singularity. The sequence continues to present these figures as part of a group. The geography remains unchanged. Gob appears again as the site of conflict, reinforcing its role within the sequence. The narrative does not introduce new locations. It maintains the same geographic framework, allowing the focus to remain on the recurring encounters within familiar terrain. The tone remains restrained. There is no expansion of detail or increase in descriptive language. The narrative continues to present each element with precision and brevity. The encounter is recorded as part of the sequence, without elevation or emphasis. The presence of Sibbecai introduces another individual within David's circle. The record does not elaborate on his role beyond this action. His identity is defined by his association and his participation in the encounter. The narrative allows his action to establish his place within the sequence. The outcome aligns with the established pattern. Saph falls and the encounter concludes. The narrative does not revisit the event or expand upon its consequences. It maintains its structure, recording the essential details and moving forward. The repetition of this structure strengthens the continuity of the sequence. The reader recognizes the pattern through its consistent application. Each encounter reinforces the same elements, allowing the narrative to build a unified sequence without extended explanation. The absence of variation becomes a defining feature. The narrative does not introduce new forms or alter its arrangement. It preserves the same structure across each entry, ensuring that the connection between encounters remains clear. Through this consistency, the presence associated with the lineage is confirmed as ongoing. Saph's appearance demonstrates that the earlier encounter was not singular. The sequence continues to present multiple figures connected by the same designation, each appearing within the same geographic framework and meeting the same outcome. The role of David's warriors is now established within this framework. Sibbecai's action follows the pattern introduced earlier, reinforcing the shift in responsibility. The narrative does not return to the decision that initiated this shift. It allows the sequence itself to reflect its effect. The record does not pause after this encounter. It continues within the same structure, preserving the pattern and preparing to introduce the next figure within the sequence. The sequence continues with the same measured precision. The account of Saf does not expand beyond its established form, yet its placement within the record strengthens the structure already in motion. The repetition of elements, name, lineage, location, and outcome, remains unchanged, and through this repetition, the narrative reinforces continuity without alteration. Saf's identification remains central to this entry. He is named, and the designation is applied without variation. The record does not introduce additional descriptors or distinctions. His identity is defined through the same framework used in earlier encounters. The consistency of this method ensures that his appearance aligns fully with the sequence. The designation, descendants of Rapha, continues to function as the primary link. It is not restated with explanation, nor is it expanded. Its presence alone is sufficient to connect Saf to the figures already encountered. The narrative does not shift its use of the term. It maintains precision in its application, preserving the clarity of the lineage. The location remains fixed within the established geography. Gob appears again as the site of conflict, reinforcing its role as a recurring ground of engagement. The record does not describe the terrain or the conditions of the battle. It names the location and proceeds. The repetition of this place continues to anchor the sequence within a defined region. This consistency of place removes the need for additional context. The reader is not introduced to new settings or unfamiliar terrain. The narrative remains within its established boundaries, allowing each encounter to be understood within the same geographic framework. The repetition of Gob ensures that the sequence retains its spatial continuity. The presence of Sibbecai is preserved through his action. He is identified as the one who confronts Saf, and his association with David is implied through the structure of the record. The narrative does not expand on his identity beyond this moment. His role is defined by his intervention, and that intervention is recorded with the same brevity as earlier entries. The outcome follows the established pattern. Saf falls and the encounter concludes. The narrative does not describe the manner of the defeat. It does not provide additional detail about the conflict. The result is stated, and the record proceeds. This repetition confirms that the earlier shift in structure remains in place. The responsibility for confronting these figures continues to rest with David's warriors. The narrative does not return to the decision that established this arrangement. It demonstrates its effect through the sequence itself, presenting each encounter within the same adjusted framework. The absence of David's direct involvement remains consistent. He is not present within this encounter as an active participant. The narrative does not highlight this absence. It allows it to be understood through comparison with earlier accounts. The structure now reflects the boundary that has been set. The role of the warriors becomes more clearly defined through repetition. Abishai's intervention introduced the pattern, and Sibbecai's action confirms it. The narrative does not expand on their roles individually. It presents them within the same framework, allowing their actions to establish their significance. The sequence continues to build through accumulation. Each encounter adds to the pattern without altering it. The repetition of elements creates a steady progression, where the reader recognizes the structure through familiarity. The narrative does not rely on variation. It relies on consistency. The presence associated with the lineage is further confirmed. Saf's appearance reinforces that the figures encountered are not isolated. The designation continues to connect them, and the repetition of encounters within the same geography strengthens this connection. The narrative does not state this explicitly. It allows the pattern to demonstrate it. The restrained tone remains unchanged. There is no increase in descriptive language or expansion of detail. The narrative maintains its concise form, preserving the sequence with clarity and precision. Each element is presented as part of the record, without emphasis or interpretation. The alignment of lineage, location, and outcome remains intact. These elements continue to appear together within each entry, forming the structure that defines the sequence. The narrative does not separate them. It preserves their alignment, ensuring that each encounter contributes to the same pattern. The role of the sequence becomes more apparent through this alignment. The encounters are not presented as independent events. They are part of a unified process, recorded within the same framework. The repetition of structure allows the reader to perceive this unity without additional explanation. The record does not pause to summarize the significance of Saph's appearance. It includes the encounter as part of the sequence and continues forward. The narrative does not reflect on the pattern it is building. It allows the structure itself to carry the meaning. The continuity established through earlier entries remains unbroken. The designation is applied consistently. The geography remains fixed. The outcomes are recorded in the same manner. The presence of David's warriors continues to define the encounters. The narrative maintains all these elements without variation. This consistency prepares the sequence for further entries. The reader now recognizes the pattern fully. Each new encounter will follow the same structure, introducing another figure within the same lineage and within the same geographic framework. The narrative has established its form, and it continues within it. The account of Saph stands as a confirmation rather than a departure. It does not introduce new elements. It reinforces those already present. The repetition of structure ensures that the sequence remains coherent, each entry contributing to the same unified pattern. The narrative proceeds without interruption. It does not mark the transition to the next encounter. It continues within the same measured form, prepared to present another figure within the lineage, maintaining the same alignment of place, designation, and outcome that has defined the sequence thus far. The record introduces a connection that has not been stated until this point. After presenting multiple figures within the same lineage and within the same geographic framework, the narrative now identifies an individual through a direct relationship to a previously known figure. The name given is Lami, and his identification includes a specific detail that links him to the earlier account. He is described as the brother of Goliath. This designation is presented without expansion. The record does not pause to recount the earlier encounter. It does not restate the details of Goliath's appearance or his defeat. Instead, it introduces Lami within the current sequence and attaches to him this familial connection. The narrative allows the reader to recognize the significance of the link through memory rather than repetition. The setting remains unchanged. The encounter takes place within the same Philistine territory that has defined the sequence. The record names the location in the same manner as before, without elaboration. The geography continues to function as a stable framework, allowing the focus to remain on the individuals and their relationships. The designation is applied alongside the familial link. Lami is identified not only as the brother of Goliath, but also as one of the descendants of Rapha. The narrative preserves both elements within the same entry, aligning the familial connection with the broader lineage already established. This dual identification strengthens the continuity within the sequence. The record does not separate these elements. It presents them together, allowing the relationship between the earlier account and the current sequence to emerge through their alignment. The familial connection does not replace the designation. It complements it, adding a layer of specificity to the pattern that has been developing. The presence of this connection alters the structure of the sequence. The earlier encounters established continuity through repetition of designation and location. This entry introduces continuity through direct relationship. The narrative now links the sequence not only through shared classification, but through familial ties that extend back to the earlier narrative. The figure of Goliath is not reintroduced as a central subject. He is referenced through Lami, and this reference is brief. The record does not expand on his role or revisit his significance. It allows the mention of his name to carry its own weight, connecting the earlier account to the present sequence without interruption. The encounter follows the established form. Lami is named. His identification is given. The location is recorded. The warrior who confronts him is introduced. The outcome is stated. The narrative maintains its concise structure, ensuring that this entry aligns with those that precede it. The warrior named in this encounter is Elhanan. He is identified in the same manner as Abishai and Sibbecai. The record does not provide extended detail about him. His role is defined through his action within the encounter. The narrative preserves this consistency, allowing each warrior to be introduced through participation rather than description. The confrontation is resolved without elaboration. Elhanan strikes Lami, and the outcome is final. The narrative does not describe the progression of the encounter. It records the essential elements and proceeds. The presence of additional detail in the identification does not alter the structure of the event. The inclusion of the familial connection serves a specific function within the sequence. It confirms that the earlier encounter with Goliath was not isolated. The narrative does not state this directly. It presents Lami's relationship and allows the connection to be understood through that detail. The lineage and the family connection align within this entry. The designation, descendants of Rapha, continues to connect Lami to the broader group, while the identification as Goliath's brother links him to a specific figure within that group. The narrative preserves both levels of connection without expanding on either. This alignment deepens the continuity of the sequence. The reader now encounters a figure who is not only part of the same lineage, but directly related to one previously known. The pattern established through repetition gains an additional layer through this connection. The geography remains constant throughout the entry. The location is named, and the narrative proceeds. The repetition of place continues to anchor the sequence within the same region. The introduction of a familial link does not alter the setting. It is integrated into the existing framework. The tone remains unchanged. The narrative does not elevate the significance of this connection through extended description. It presents the detail with the same restraint that defines the sequence. The importance of the link is conveyed through its placement within the structure. The presence of Elhanan reinforces the pattern of distributed responsibility. As with earlier encounters, the figure associated with the lineage is confronted by one of David's warriors. The narrative maintains this arrangement, demonstrating that the shift introduced earlier continues to define the sequence. The outcome aligns with the established pattern. Lami falls, and the encounter concludes. The narrative does not expand on the consequences of this event. It records the result and moves forward. The inclusion of this familial connection prepares the sequence for its continuation. The narrative has now linked the earlier account to the current sequence through a direct relationship. The structure remains consistent, yet the continuity has been strengthened through this addition. The record does not pause after presenting this connection. It continues within the same measured form, preserving the pattern and preparing to introduce the next figure within the sequence. The record continues from the point of connection, without altering its pace. The identification of Lami as the brother of Goliath remains within the text as a fixed detail, and the narrative proceeds without returning to it for further expansion. The mention is not repeated, and it is not explained. It stands within the entry as part of the structure, allowing its significance to persist without interruption. This single detail extends the sequence across time. The earlier encounter with Goliath, though not restated, is now directly linked to the present sequence through familial relation. The narrative does not construct a bridge through commentary. It allows the connection to exist through the shared name, preserved briefly and then carried forward within the structure. The lineage remains unchanged within this connection. Lami continues to be identified as one of the descendants of Rapha. The narrative does not separate his familial link from the broader designation. Both elements are preserved together, ensuring that the individual is understood within the same framework as the others while also holding a distinct position within it. The presence of Elhanan remains defined through action. The record does not expand on his identity beyond his role in the encounter. His intervention follows the established pattern. He confronts the figure associated with the lineage and brings the encounter to its conclusion. The narrative preserves this consistency, maintaining the structure introduced in earlier entries. The outcome aligns fully with the sequence. Lami falls, and the encounter is complete. The narrative does not elaborate on the circumstances of the defeat. It records the result with the same brevity that defines the sequence. The presence of additional detail in the identification does not alter the form of the account. The geography remains consistent. The encounter occurs within the same Philistine territory that has framed the sequence. The location is named, and the narrative proceeds. The repetition of place continues to anchor the events within a defined landscape, reinforcing continuity across the entries. The alignment of elements within this entry remains intact. Name, designation, location, action, and outcome are presented in the same order as before. The addition of a familial connection does not disrupt this alignment. It is integrated into the existing structure, maintaining the coherence of the sequence. The significance of this connection emerges through placement rather than explanation. The narrative does not interpret the relationship between Lami and Goliath. It does not describe how their connection influences the broader context. It allows the detail to stand within the entry, trusting the reader to recognize its importance through association. This approach preserves the tone of the record. There is no shift toward elaboration or emphasis. The narrative maintains its restrained form, presenting each element with clarity and precision. The connection is included because it is part of the record, and it is left without further development. The sequence now carries both repetition and direct linkage. Earlier entries established continuity through the repeated use of designation and geography. This entry adds a direct familial tie, connecting the present encounters to a specific figure from the earlier narrative. The combination of these elements strengthens the unity of the sequence. The presence of multiple warriors continues to define the structure. Elhanan's action follows those of Abishai and Sibbecai. Each is introduced through participation in an encounter, and each contributes to the pattern of distributed responsibility. The narrative does not expand on their roles beyond these actions. Their significance is conveyed through repetition. The absence of David's direct involvement remains consistent. The narrative does not return him to the center of the encounter. The boundary established earlier continues to shape the sequence. The figures associated with the lineage are confronted by David's servants, and the record preserves this arrangement without variation. The repetition of outcomes reinforces the pattern. Each figure falls, and each encounter concludes within the same structure. The narrative does not vary the result. It maintains consistency across entries, ensuring that each contributes to the same unified sequence. The introduction of Lami deepens the sense of continuity without altering the form. The familial connection adds a layer to the narrative, yet the structure remains unchanged. The record continues to present each encounter within the same measured framework, allowing the sequence to progress without disruption. The presence of Goliath within this entry is indirect yet significant. His name appears only in relation to Lami, and the narrative does not expand beyond that mention. The earlier account is not revisited, yet its influence is felt through this connection. The sequence now includes a figure who is directly tied to that earlier moment. The record does not draw attention to this influence. It does not reflect on the continuity it has established. It presents the connection as part of the entry and proceeds. The meaning is carried within the structure, not within commentary. The sequence moves forward with its pattern intact. The lineage continues to connect the figures. The geography remains fixed. The warriors of David continue to act within the encounters. The outcomes remain consistent. The narrative preserves all these elements without variation. This entry stands as a point of reinforcement. It confirms that the earlier confrontation was part of a broader presence within the same region and within the same lineage. The connection is established through relation rather than repetition, adding depth to the sequence without altering its form. The record continues without pause. It does not mark the transition to the next encounter. It maintains its measured pace, prepared to introduce the final figure within the same lineage, within the same geography, and within the same structure that has now been fully established. The record presents the final figure with a distinguishing detail. It does not begin with a name in the same manner as earlier entries. Instead, the narrative introduces this individual through a physical description, one that is stated clearly and without expansion. The figure is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The detail appears briefly, set within the same measured structure that has defined the sequence. The narrative does not interpret this description. It does not pause to explain its meaning or its origin. The detail is included as part of the identification, and the record proceeds. The presence of this feature distinguishes the figure within the sequence, yet it does not alter the tone or structure of the account. The designation is applied alongside the description. The figure is identified again as one of the descendants of Rapha. The narrative maintains consistency in this element, ensuring that the individual remains connected to the lineage established earlier. The physical description and the designation appear together, aligning this entry with those that precede it. The location remains within the same geographic framework. The encounter takes place in Philistine territory, within the regions already named in earlier entries. The narrative does not introduce a new setting. It preserves the established landscape, allowing the sequence to remain grounded in the same places. The structure of the entry follows the established pattern. The figure is introduced, the designation is stated, the location is recorded, the opposing warrior is named, the outcome is presented. The narrative maintains its concise form, ensuring that this final encounter aligns with the others. The warrior introduced in this entry is Jonathan. He is identified as the son of Shimei, who is associated with David's family. The record does not expand on his background beyond this identification. His presence is defined through his role within the encounter, consistent with the introduction of other warriors in the sequence. The confrontation is recorded without elaboration. Jonathan strikes the figure, and the outcome is final. The narrative does not describe the progression of the encounter or the manner of the strike. It presents the essential elements and proceeds, maintaining the same restrained tone. The inclusion of the physical description serves a distinct function within the sequence. Earlier entries identified figures through name and designation, with occasional reference to physical attributes. This entry places the physical detail at the forefront of the identification. The narrative does not expand on it, yet its presence distinguishes this figure from those that precede him. The repetition of the designation ensures continuity. Despite the distinctive description, the figure remains connected to the same lineage. The narrative does not separate him from the group. It preserves the alignment between physical distinction and shared classification. The geography remains unchanged. The encounter occurs within the same regions that have defined the sequence. The narrative continues to rely on the repetition of place to maintain continuity. The physical detail does not alter the setting. It is integrated into the existing framework. The role of David's warriors continues to define the structure. Jonathan's action follows the pattern established by Abishai, Sibbecai, and Elhanan. Each warrior is introduced through participation in an encounter, and each contributes to the sequence through a decisive outcome. The narrative does not expand on their roles beyond these actions. The absence of David's direct involvement remains consistent. The boundary established earlier continues to shape the sequence. The king is not present as the central figure in this encounter. The narrative does not highlight this absence. It allows the pattern to remain unchanged. The outcome aligns with the established pattern. The figure falls and the encounter concludes. The narrative does not vary this result. It maintains consistency across entries, ensuring that each contributes to the same unified sequence. The physical description remains without expansion. The narrative does not return to it after stating it. It does not compare it to earlier descriptions or provide additional detail. The feature is included as part of the identification, and it stands on its own within the entry. This restraint preserves the tone of the record. The narrative does not elevate the description through emphasis or interpretation. It maintains its measured form, presenting each element with clarity and precision. The sequence reaches its final entry within this pattern. The figure introduced here represents the culmination of the series of encounters. The narrative does not announce this conclusion. It presents the entry within the same structure, allowing the reader to recognize its position within the sequence. The alignment of elements remains intact. Lineage, location, opposition, and outcome are presented together once more. The addition of a distinctive physical detail does not alter this alignment. It reinforces the pattern while providing a final variation within it. The record does not pause after this encounter. It continues within the same measured form, preserving the structure and preparing to gather the sequence into its closing statement. The record continues without returning to the description. The detail of 6 fingers and 6 toes remains within the text as it was first presented, stated once and not repeated. The narrative does not expand upon it, and it does not provide further distinction beyond that single reference. The figure is identified, and the account proceeds in the same restrained manner that has defined the sequence. This restraint preserves the balance of the entry. The physical detail distinguishes the individual, yet it does not dominate the structure of the record. The narrative does not elevate it above the other elements. It remains one part of the identification, aligned with the designation and the location within the same framework. The designation continues to anchor the figure within the lineage. The individual is again identified as one of the descendants of Rapha. The narrative maintains consistency in this element, ensuring that the final figure is connected to those who have appeared before. The physical distinction does not separate him from the group. It is integrated into the same classification. The geography remains unchanged. The encounter occurs within the same Philistine territory that has framed the sequence. The record names the location and proceeds without elaboration. The repetition of place continues to unify the entries, allowing each encounter to exist within a shared landscape. The presence of Jonathan follows the established pattern. He is introduced through his association and his action within the encounter. The narrative does not expand on his position beyond what is necessary for identification. His role is defined by his intervention, consistent with the introduction of other warriors in the sequence. The confrontation is resolved with the same clarity. Jonathan strikes the figure, and the outcome is final. The narrative does not describe the sequence of actions leading to this moment. It records the essential elements and concludes the encounter within the same concise form. The repetition of this structure confirms the completion of the pattern. Each entry has followed the same arrangement. A figure identified by name or description, connected to the lineage, encountered within the same geographic framework, and defeated by one of David's warriors. This final entry preserves all of these elements without variation. The inclusion of a distinctive physical marker does not alter the sequence. It provides a final point of differentiation within the pattern, yet it does not change the structure. The narrative remains consistent, ensuring that the sequence concludes in alignment with its established form. The absence of elaboration continues to define the tone. The record does not interpret the physical detail. It does not explain its significance or its origin. It allows the description to stand as it is, integrated into the entry without further development. The lineage remains the central connection across the sequence. The repeated identification of each figure as a descendant of Rapha continues to unify the entries. The final figure is no exception. The narrative preserves this connection, ensuring that the sequence remains cohesive. The role of David's warriors remains unchanged. Jonathan's action follows those of Abishai, Sibbecai, and Elhanan. Each has acted within the same framework, confronting a figure associated with the lineage and bringing the encounter to its conclusion. The narrative does not expand on their collective role. It presents their actions within the sequence. The absence of David's direct involvement remains consistent through the final entry. The boundary established earlier continues to shape the structure. The narrative does not revisit that decision. It demonstrates its effect through the continued presence of the warriors in these encounters. The outcome aligns with the established pattern once more. The figure falls and the encounter concludes. The narrative does not vary this result. It maintains the same consistency across all entries, reinforcing the unity of the sequence. The repetition of elements reaches its completion here. Lineage, location, opposition, and outcome have been presented together across each encounter. The final entry preserves these elements without alteration, confirming the pattern that has been built throughout the sequence. The record does not announce this completion. It does not mark the final entry with additional emphasis or reflection. It presents the encounter in the same manner as the others, allowing the reader to recognize its position within the sequence through the accumulation of entries. The presence of the distinctive physical detail serves as a final confirmation. It distinguishes the individual while remaining within the same framework. The narrative includes it without expansion, ensuring that the tone remains consistent. The sequence now holds its full structure. Each encounter has contributed to the same pattern, and the final entry aligns with those that precede it. The narrative has preserved its form across all entries, maintaining clarity through repetition and restraint. With this, the record is prepared to gather these encounters into a concluding statement. The figures have been presented, the lineage has been maintained, and the geography has remained fixed. The narrative does not expand further. It continues within its measured form, ready to bring the sequence into its final summary. The record turns from the figures to those who confront them. Until this point, each encounter has been structured around the appearance of an individual associated with the lineage and the outcome that follows. The narrative has preserved the names of those individuals, identified their designation, and recorded their defeat. Now, without altering its tone, the record allows another pattern to emerge, one centered not on the opponents, but on the men who stand against them. These men are introduced through repetition. Their names appear within each entry, aligned with the same structure that defines the sequence. Abishai is named in the first encounter. Sibbecai appears in the next. Elhanan follows. Jonathan is recorded in the final entry. The narrative does not group them together in a list. It presents them individually within separate encounters, allowing their connection to form gradually through repetition. The record does not expand on their identities in detail. Each is identified briefly, often through association, either with David or within a known family line. The narrative does not provide extended descriptions of their roles or ranks. It introduces them through their actions, preserving the same concise form used throughout the sequence. Their actions define their presence. Each man is recorded as the one who confronts and defeats a figure associated with the lineage. The narrative does not describe their movements or their methods. It states the outcome with clarity, allowing the action itself to establish their significance. Through this repetition, a collective structure begins to take shape. The encounters are no longer understood as isolated moments between individual opponents. They become part of a broader pattern in which multiple figures within David's circle act in succession. The narrative does not state this structure explicitly. It allows it to emerge through the arrangement of entries. The presence of David remains within the framework. He is not removed from the narrative, yet his role has shifted. The earlier decision made by his servants established a boundary, and the sequence has continued within that boundary. The king remains the central authority, but the direct action within these encounters is carried out by others. This arrangement reflects a distributed responsibility. The record does not define this concept in abstract terms. It presents it through the repeated actions of the warriors. Each encounter reinforces the same pattern. A figure associated with the lineage appears, and one of David's servants confronts him. The narrative does not isolate these men from one another. They are not presented as independent figures acting separately. Their actions are recorded within the same sequence, under the same authority, and within the same geographic framework. This alignment allows the reader to understand them as part of a single body rather than as unrelated individuals. The structure of the record supports this understanding. Each entry follows the same arrangement, and each includes the name of the warrior who acts within that encounter. The repetition of this structure places the warriors in parallel positions, reinforcing their collective role within the sequence. The geography remains constant. The encounters occur within the same Philistine territory, anchored by the same locations that have appeared throughout the sequence. The warriors act within this fixed landscape, and their repeated presence within these locations further connects them to one another. The lineage also remains consistent. Each figure they confront is identified as belonging to the same designation. The narrative does not vary this element. It preserves the connection across all entries, ensuring that the warriors are understood as confronting members of the same group. This alignment of elements, warriors, lineage, and geography, creates a unified framework. The record does not expand on this framework through explanation. It presents it through repetition, allowing the reader to observe the pattern as it unfolds. The names of the warriors become markers within the sequence. Each name is associated with a specific encounter, yet the repetition of structure ensures that no single individual is elevated above the others within this passage. The narrative maintains balance, presenting each action within the same measured form. The absence of extended detail contributes to this balance. The record does not describe the training, rank, or history of these men. It does not provide additional context beyond what is necessary for identification. Their significance is conveyed through their participation in the sequence. The cumulative effect of their actions becomes apparent. Each encounter contributes to the same outcome, the removal of figures associated with the lineage. The narrative does not summarize this process at this stage. It allows the repeated outcomes to establish it. The warriors act within the authority of the king. Though David is not the one directly engaging in these encounters, his presence remains central to the structure. The narrative does not separate the actions of the warriors from his authority. Their role exists within the framework of his reign. This relationship is not described in detail. The record does not outline the organization of the military body or the hierarchy within it. It presents the warriors as those who act in the encounters, and their association with David is understood through the structure of the narrative. The repetition of their involvement reinforces their collective role. Each new entry adds another name, another action, another outcome. The pattern continues without variation, and through this continuity, the narrative establishes the presence of a group acting in coordination. The sequence does not shift its focus entirely away from the figures associated with the lineage. It maintains the alignment between the opponents and those who confront them. Yet the repeated inclusion of the warriors' names gradually brings their role into clearer view. The record continues within this framework. It preserves the same structure, allowing the pattern of collective action to emerge through repetition rather than through explicit statement. The record continues by allowing the collective presence of these men to become fully established through accumulation. Their names, introduced one by one across separate encounters, now form a pattern that extends beyond individual action. The narrative does not gather them into a formal list within this passage, yet their repeated appearance within the same structure binds them together. Each name stands within its own entry, but none stands alone. Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan remain aligned through their actions. The record does not compare them or distinguish their abilities. It does not assign greater weight to one over another. Each is presented within the same arrangement. A figure appears, the warrior confronts him, and the outcome is recorded. The consistency of this structure ensures that their roles remain parallel. This parallel arrangement creates a unified presence. The narrative does not describe the warriors as a group in abstract terms. It presents them through repeated action, allowing the reader to understand their connection through the sequence itself. Their unity is not stated, it is observed. The authority under which they act remains implicit. David is not present as the central figure within these encounters, yet his position is not diminished. The record maintains his place within the broader framework of the narrative. The actions of the warriors occur within the structure of his reign, and their association with him remains constant. The earlier decision of the servants continues to shape this arrangement. The boundary established at that moment is not revisited, yet its effect is evident. The encounters proceed without David's direct involvement, and the warriors act in his place. The narrative does not emphasize this transition. It allows it to remain embedded within the sequence. The geography continues to provide stability. The encounters occur within the same regions, anchored by the repeated naming of places such as Gath and Gob. The warriors operate within this fixed landscape, and their actions are consistently recorded within it. The narrative does not expand beyond these locations, maintaining the same geographic framework. The lineage remains unchanged as well. Each figure confronted by the warriors is identified as belonging to the same designation. The narrative preserves this consistency across all entries. The warriors do not face varied or unrelated opponents. They confront members of the same lineage, reinforcing the unity of the sequence. The repetition of outcomes continues to define the pattern. Each encounter concludes with the defeat of the figure associated with the lineage. The narrative does not vary this result. It maintains the same clarity across all entries, ensuring that each action contributes to the same process. This process becomes more apparent when viewed collectively. The record does not summarize it directly at this stage, yet the accumulation of encounters reveals a consistent movement. The figures associated with the lineage appear one after another, and each is removed through the action of one of David's warriors. The pattern is steady and unbroken. The warriors function as a coordinated presence within this process. The narrative does not describe their coordination in detail. It does not outline their movements or their planning. It presents their actions within the sequence, allowing the repetition to suggest their collective role. The absence of extended description maintains the tone. The record does not expand on the characteristics of these men beyond their names and actions. It preserves the same concise form, ensuring that the focus remains on the sequence itself rather than on individual narratives. The structure of the entries continues to align each warrior with the others. Each name appears within the same position in the sequence, associated with the same type of action and the same outcome. The narrative does not alter this arrangement, reinforcing the sense of unity among them. The role of the king remains present through this alignment. Though David does not act directly within these encounters, the narrative does not separate the actions of the warriors from his authority. Their repeated identification as his servants maintains this connection, ensuring that the structure of leadership remains intact. The collective role of the warriors reflects the strength of the broader structure. The record does not describe this strength in abstract terms. It presents it through repeated action, allowing the reader to observe how responsibility is carried across multiple individuals within the same framework. The sequence reaches a point where the pattern is complete. The figures associated with the lineage have been presented, and each has been confronted by one of David's warriors. The narrative has preserved the same structure across all entries, ensuring that the sequence remains coherent. The record does not alter its tone as it approaches its conclusion. It continues to present each element with the same restraint, maintaining clarity through repetition. The collective role of the warriors is not elevated through commentary. It is established through the structure of the sequence itself. The alignment of lineage, geography, and action remains intact. The warriors operate within the same regions, confront the same type of opponents, and achieve the same outcome. The narrative preserves this alignment across all entries, reinforcing the unity of the sequence. The cumulative effect of their actions prepares the record for its final statement. The sequence has demonstrated a consistent pattern, and the presence of the warriors within that pattern has been established through repetition. The narrative does not summarize this process yet. It continues within its measured form, ready to gather these elements into a single concluding line. And within this structure, the role of David's warriors stands fully formed, not as isolated individuals, but as a collective presence operating within the authority of the king and within the same restrained framework that has defined the entire sequence. The record gathers the sequence into a single line. After presenting each encounter within the same measured structure, the narrative does not continue with additional entries. Instead, it introduces a concluding statement that brings together the elements already established. This statement does not expand upon the events. It does not introduce new figures or new locations. It preserves what has been presented and places it within a unified form. The figures are identified collectively. The record refers to them as those connected to the descendants of Rapha and Gath. This phrasing brings together the two elements that have defined the sequence, lineage and location. The narrative does not restate each individual name. It gathers them into a single designation, allowing the sequence to be understood as a whole. The location remains central within this statement. Gath is named again, serving as the point of origin associated with the figures. The narrative does not expand on the city. It includes the name as part of the closing line, reinforcing the geographic continuity that has been present throughout the sequence. The repetition of place is resolved through this inclusion. The earlier entries established Gath and the surrounding regions as the setting for each encounter. The closing statement brings that repetition into a single reference, allowing the geography to remain present within the conclusion without restating each location individually. The lineage is also preserved within the statement. The designation, descendants of Rapha, appears once more, connecting all the figures within the sequence. The narrative does not redefine the term. It includes it as part of the summary, ensuring that the connection established across the entries remains intact. The outcome is presented in collective form. The record states that these figures fell at the hands of David and his servants. This phrasing gathers the repeated outcomes of individual encounters into a single statement. The narrative does not list each action again. It summarizes the results with precision. The inclusion of both David and his servants reflects the structure of the sequence. Earlier entries introduced a shift in responsibility, where the warriors acted within the encounters. The closing statement preserves this arrangement by naming both the king and those who served him. The narrative does not expand on their roles. It includes them together within the same line. This statement resolves the pattern established earlier. Each encounter followed the same structure, presenting a figure, a location, an action, and an outcome. The closing line brings these elements together without repeating them individually. It allows the sequence to conclude within the same restrained form. The narrative does not elaborate on the significance of this conclusion. It does not interpret the events or assign meaning to their completion. The record maintains its measured tone, presenting the summary as part of the sequence rather than as a separate reflection. The absence of expansion remains consistent. The closing statement does not introduce additional detail. It does not revisit the individual encounters or provide further description. It relies on the structure already established to convey its meaning. The unity of the sequence becomes clear within this summary. The figures are no longer presented individually. They are understood as part of a single group, connected by lineage and location. The repeated encounters are now seen as parts of a completed pattern. The narrative does not alter its tone as it presents this conclusion. It continues to use the same restrained language that has defined the sequence. The closing statement is presented with clarity and precision, without emphasis or elaboration. The structure of the record supports this form of conclusion. The earlier entries built the pattern through repetition. The closing line gathers that pattern into a single statement, allowing the sequence to conclude without changing its method. The presence of David and his servants within the statement reflects the alignment established earlier. The king remains central within the broader framework, while the actions of his warriors are preserved alongside his name. The narrative does not separate these roles. It presents them together as part of the conclusion. The geography and lineage remain inseparable within this summary. Gath and the descendants of Rapha appear together once more, reinforcing the connection between place and identity that has defined the sequence. The narrative does not expand on this connection. It preserves it within the structure of the statement. The outcome is final within this line. The figures are described as having fallen, and the narrative does not revisit them. The repetition of encounters has reached its completion, and the summary confirms this without elaboration. The record does not pause after presenting this statement. It continues within the broader framework of the text, moving beyond the sequence without reflection. The conclusion is integrated into the narrative, not separated from it. In this way, the sequence is brought to its end through structure rather than expansion. The pattern that has been established across multiple entries is resolved within a single line, preserving the same measured tone and allowing the record to conclude without altering its form. The record allows the conclusion to stand without reinforcement. It does not return to the statement or restate its elements in expanded form. The line remains as it was first presented, complete, self-contained, and integrated into the sequence. The narrative does not linger on it. It moves forward, leaving the summary to carry its own weight within the structure. This restraint preserves the method that has defined the entire passage. The earlier entries did not expand beyond what was necessary to record each encounter. The closing statement follows the same approach. It gathers the repeated elements, lineage, location, and outcome, without altering the tone or introducing additional detail. The collective identification remains central. The figures are no longer distinguished by individual names or descriptions. They are referred to together, connected through the designation that has appeared throughout the sequence. The narrative does not separate them once more. It preserves their unity within the summary. The location remains fixed within the conclusion. Gath appears again as the point of reference, maintaining the geographic continuity established earlier. The narrative does not include Gob or the surrounding regions individually. It allows the single reference to Gath to represent the broader setting. This consolidation reflects the structure of the sequence. The repeated nomming of locations across earlier entries is now brought into a single reference. The narrative does not restate each place. It resolves the pattern through inclusion rather than repetition. The outcome is likewise gathered into a unified form. The repeated defeats recorded in each encounter are now expressed collectively. The figures are described as having fallen, and the narrative does not revisit the individual events. The summary preserves the result without recounting the process. The presence of David and his servants remains aligned within the statement. The narrative does not separate their roles in the conclusion. It includes them together, reflecting the arrangement that developed across the sequence. The king's authority and the actions of his warriors are presented as part of the same outcome. This alignment confirms the structure that has been established. Earlier entries introduced a shift in how the encounters were carried out. The closing statement preserves that shift without explanation. It includes both the king and his servants within the same line, maintaining the balance that has defined the sequence. The absence of elaboration continues to shape the tone. The record does not interpret the significance of the conclusion. It does not reflect on the removal of the figures or the completion of the pattern. It presents the summary and proceeds, maintaining the same measured form. The unity of the sequence is now fully apparent. The repeated encounters, the consistent designation, the fixed geography, and the aligned outcomes have all been brought together within this single statement. The narrative does not need to restate these elements individually. Their presence within the summary confirms their connection. The record does not introduce any further figures within this context. The sequence has reached its completion. The narrative does not extend it with additional entries. It allows the pattern to conclude within the structure already established. The transition beyond this point is quiet. There is no marked shift in tone or style. The record continues within the broader framework of the text, moving beyond the sequence without drawing attention to the conclusion. The summary remains as part of the narrative, not as a separate ending. The method of closure reflects the method of the sequence itself. Just as the encounters were presented without elaboration, the conclusion is given without expansion. The narrative relies on structure rather than explanation, allowing the arrangement of elements to convey completion. The lineage remains preserved within the summary. The designation descendants of Rapha continues to connect the figures, even as they are referred to collectively. The narrative does not redefine the term. It includes it once more, ensuring that the connection remains clear. The geography remains present through its single reference. Gath stands within the conclusion as the representative location, maintaining continuity with the earlier entries. The narrative does not expand on its significance. It allows the repetition of the name to carry its meaning. The outcome remains final and unaltered. The figures have fallen, and the narrative does not return to them. The repetition of encounters has reached its end, and the summary confirms this without variation. The record continues beyond this point with the same restraint. It does not reflect on the sequence that has concluded. It does not assign greater significance to its completion. It preserves the structure and proceeds, maintaining the tone that has defined the entire passage. In this way, the closing pattern remains consistent with all that has come before. The sequence is resolved through a single line that gathers its elements without expansion. The narrative does not alter its method. It completes the account within the same measured form, leaving the structure intact as it moves forward into the broader record.